great to see everybody. And what should we say about the future of work? Well, for me, it started about 8 years ago. I have, actually, some of you know that I'm just about to be married, so I now have a family of 8 children. But 8 years, some years ago, I only had 2. Suddenly, it's increased enormously. And I took one of them, my son Dominic, who was at that age, 13, 14, 15, was doing, I think, those of you who've got kids will know, he was doing what sort of boys of that age do, which was sitting in his bedroom in Primrose Hill with a computer a lot of the time. And I said, Dom, we've really got to, you're of an age where you've really got to see the rest of the world. And you've just also, sort of age man thing, wouldn't it be marvelous if you could spend time with real men? So I'm thinking, well, where are the real men in the world? No comment about that right now. And I thought about the Maasai warriors. What better place for Dom to see real guys with spears to kill lions, way away from technology. And so we got on a little plane and then eventually ended up in this tiny village, Maasai village, where no electricity, watching the sunset. I mean, just marvelous stuff, really, and really away from everything that is, central London and teenagers. And as we stood with a Maasai warrior on the top of a hill, talking about, the world and the greater things of being a man, there was a funny little sound. Can anyone imagine what that funny little sound was? It was his mobile phone. Now, actually, that for me was the beginning of the Future of Work. And it was that year I started the Future of Work Consortium, which I really thought at the time would only last, and some of you here are members of it, I only thought it would last a couple of years. And then we'd have the end of the story. We'd know what the future of work would be, and that would be it. Well, of course, that's not it. And I have to say, even this week I've been to 2 conferences about the future of work where it's really obvious that things are changing enormously. Oh, by the way, I must show this other photograph. One of my MBA students sent me this. Can you see it? Can you see what that is there? You know how the Maasai have these great holes in their ears? That's where he keeps his mobile phone. Of course, that's what we all need to do that. So I really wanted to talk first of all about technology, the impact of technology on work. Not to say, by the way, that I have the answers to that, because my view is that this is an emerging narrative. But it's a narrative that each one of you, in terms of your role in your organization, you need to have a point of view on. And actually, I have a point of view, and I wanted to share some of that with you. The first thing to remind ourselves is that the sort of technology that's connecting that Maasai warrior is actually connecting people all over the world. This is really an interesting set of data from an Australian company called Freelancer. And what they do is they buy and they're a platform that buys and sells work, so you can buy work from them, you can get someone to do the work you want, mostly software programming, or you can sell your work as a software programmer. And this actually shows the movement of work around the world. And you can see immediately, do you see, look, there's the coast of America coming out, that's Europe, a little tiny bit happening in South America, quite a lot happening in Australia, China, and India. So this is 2013, 2014, 2015. Okay, so immediately just by looking at this, we can see, by the way, nothing's happening in Africa. Here's Africa. Because although that Maasai warrior can use a telephone, he can't use broadband. There isn't broadband in the area that he's in, and that's true for much of Africa, which is why, for many of these maps, Africa is a dark continent. But you can see how much more is happening around the world. Why is that? Well, look, this is we're so familiar with Moore's Law, aren't we? But this is an extraordinary thing. And you can see that what's happening here is that not only are people becoming more connected, but the technology that's connecting them is becoming a lot cheaper. It's becoming cheaper and it's becoming smaller. And that means that these connectivities are increasing whom and where people get connected, and of course, building the Internet of Things. So what's that going to do for work? Well, let me just make a couple of suggestions. This is, I actually was at Davos a few weeks ago, but this is not a photograph I took at Davos a couple of weeks ago. It was actually one I took a couple of years back. And what I found really interesting about it is this is a whole group of what you might call Davos men. So here they are, Thomas Friedman, New York Times, Larry Summers, economic advisor, Peter Thiel, MIT, this guy here, Stanford. No, she's on you. What the hell is she doing here? And by the way, Bill Gates is here, but I didn't get him on the photo. So why is she here? She's a 15-year-old girl from Pakistan. She comes from Lahore, in fact. And she's not the one who got the Nobel Prize, by the way. So just in case you feel... So the clue to the question is in this guy here. Stefan Tho teaches first-year degree students at Stanford in basic programming, a one-year program. And he did what a number of professors have done. He put his lectures online so that anyone could do the lectures. But more importantly, he put the exam online. Many tens of thousands of people did that very difficult exam. Can anyone imagine why she's here? She got the highest score. That's a pretty amazing thing, isn't it? How many Stanford students do you think came in the top 20? None. So we are beginning to see the democratization of talent. And that's a very important point for any of you, as many of you are, who are deeply interested in talent. Actually, I did get another one with Bill. So here is some of the technology platforms that are underlying that incredible connectivity, which is not just connecting people, but it's also connecting people and knowledge. And so the first thing I want to say is, in terms of the impact of technology on the future of work, I think it's allowing people and organizations and functions like yours to ask 4 questions. Where am I going to work? When am I going to work? How am I going to work? And what am I going to do? And let me just mention something about what am I going to do. Now, some of you are very familiar with this labor statistics from the US, but actually anything you saw in Europe or in the OECD in general would look like this. And here's what you can see. This is a phenomena called the hollowing out of work. And here it sits. So here we have skills range from low-skill work to high-skill work. This is the sort of stuff you do. This is the sort of stuff that people in factories or preparing food or looking after your elderly mother who's got Alzheimer's are doing. And this is middle-skill jobs, operators and fabricators, production and craft, office and admin. Do you see what's happening there? These jobs are disappearing extremely quickly. Why? Because basically artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics can replace any task that is a routine task, where you can actually write down what the task is. And when, in the States, for example, right now, or even in the UK, people say the job loss is to do with immigration. That's not true. Job loss is to do with automation. Massive loss of jobs. And the challenge for governments, and I've been working quite closely with the UK government before they got completely wrapped up with Brexit, is that quite a lot of these jobs, particularly these jobs like this, are jobs that men do, semi-skilled men do. They're jobs like driving a truck or working in a factory. And those are jobs that are now going. So what you're seeing is technology is now pushing out on either of those sides. It's pushing out that side with driverless trucks, which, by the way, a truck driver is the most common job title in the US right now. So what happens when all of those truck drivers no longer have a job? And it's also pushing out this way. My son, who I spoke to you about, Dominic, came back, went to university, wanted to do medicine, and is just finishing. In fact, he's finishing this month, and he's starting the long haul to be a surgeon. Now, what's he doing already? Well, already, most of the work that Dom is doing in terms of practice is not sitting there with, a pair of scissors and a needle. He's actually practicing on simulations to use robotic arms, and he's already doing that. So we are becoming augmented. So one of the challenges you face, and I don't want to underestimate this, it's a huge thing, is your employees are anxious about the impact of technology on their job. How many people would say that you feel in your organization right now that people are worried about what's going to happen to their jobs? Quite a number of you. And you, coming back to Costas's comments this morning, can't make this a burning platform. It has to be something where you build a narrative about what's going to happen to them. And I can tell you, because I'm doing this with companies right now, that's an extremely difficult thing to do. And you've got to think about what it is we say to people that acknowledges the reality of their work. So here's the paradox. And there's a few paradoxes about the impact of technology on work, but here's one of them, named after a guy called Maravek. And here it is. How many people here could play chess and beat a chess master? How many people here could do that? None of us really, could we? But actually, a pretty good computer, particularly if it's linked up with other computers, can do that. Why? Well, because chess, and indeed Go, which is a more difficult game, you can actually write the rules for it, so a computer can do it. But here's something that my 3-year-old grandchild can do incredibly easily, but a robot can't. And by the way, this is a very important phenomena here, because that means that robots find it difficult to sort stuff, to pick up an old person and to help them around. They find it difficult to do anything that requires mobility. If you notice in your organizations, those of you that use robots, they're mostly stationary, and they're sitting behind, a fence to protect humans from them. That will change. In Japan right now, remember Japan is the leading country in the world on the use of robotics. Most Japanese people feel very relaxed about being around robots. There, they are already developing a robot that really will pick your mum up and take her to the loo and sit her on the loo. And guess what? Your mum, your aged mother, would rather a robot did it than you did it. So this is going to change, and it's going to change really quickly. And why is it going to change really quickly? Well, here's the point. The point is that if you look at human learning across generations, it goes like this. We really hardly learn at all from one generation to the next. And in fact, if anything, we sometimes go back. Computers, it's just a steady increase. And so what you're going to see is very, very rapid developments in robotics and developments in artificial intelligence and machine learning. I mean, already Boston Dynamics have got this little guy. He costs a fortune, by the way, and they've stopped making him. But you can see that it's possible to make robots that sort of can stagger around. So what's the point of this? Well, here's the thing that you need to remember, and it's a very simple point. Any sort of jobs can either be, any task can be divided into something that's routine or something that's non-routine. Anything that's routine, be it, my son doing all of his wonderful surgeon stuff, or be it, which actually would sit there, manual routine, or manual or routine analytical, all of that will be substituted. All of that will be substituted. And what's left is stuff that's very difficult to make into an easily quantified rules. So some of the analytical stuff, like persuading and selling and forming hypotheses, and some of the manual stuff, like truck driving. And where are we with truck driving? I honestly thought, a couple of years back when we looked at the future of work, that governments would step in and ban autonomous vehicles. And the reason I thought they would do that is it will create mass unemployment in a workforce who are already finding it difficult to get a job. That is not going to happen. And it won't happen because no government will want to step up and regulate driverless cars. So you will see driverless cars, and it will happen probably faster than you think it will. My kids, I don't know about yours, my kids haven't learned to drive. Neither of them have driving because they said, "Well, what's the point? I'm going to have a driverless car very soon. What's the point?" So that's the first thing. The first thing to say is there is an evolving narrative around technology and work. I look at it all the time. I was at the Royal Society of Arts on Monday in a group with Google looking at the impact of technology on work. We honestly don't know where it's going. And if anyone tells you that they do, there's no way that we know. But you sit in organizations where people want the story. And I think that you have to build a narrative about augmentation, about reskilling, about lifelong learning. That's the first thing. Second thing that I think is changing the nature of work is low growth. The fact is that over the last decades, most of us are in countries where we have very low growth rates. And interestingly, if you look at the way that you've designed your organizations, particularly in terms of promotion and hierarchy, they sort of assume that you're in an industry that's growing. And now many of you are not. And I think that this is going to start questioning about the why of work. Why am I at work? What is it I'm doing? And let me just remind you, and if anyone was wondering about Brexit or Trump, they just have to look at this. This data isn't brand new, actually, but it's a very important data from the World Bank. And here's what it shows. It looks at the winners and losers over the last period of time. And here we have it. There are two major losers. One is the global poor, many of whom, particularly if they're in sub-Saharan Africa, are poorer now than they would have been 5 or 10 years ago. And the second is the traditional middle class. So this is really the first years or the first decade when your children in Europe or in the States, when asked, do you think that you'll do better than your parents, they said no. They said no. And that was a very big deal because most of us are used to living in a society where the answer is yes, things are going to get better. Now, of course, if you're living in China or in India, in the emerging economies, then when you ask the same question of children, what is it they say? They say, yes, of course. And so what we're seeing is that this group here are finding it hard. And they're also being impacted disproportionately by technology. So the RSA is just bringing out a report on the impact of technology on low-skill work. Low-skill work, by the way, is 49% of the work that's done in the UK. So that's the group who are particularly hit by technology. And at the same time, they're not seeing their way of living, their lifestyle getting any better. So where does that leave us? Well, I wrote a book some time ago called The Shift. In fact, you just heard a reference to it. And in it, I said, I wonder if the contract between the individual and the organization is going to begin to change. I don't think it has changed, but what I'm going to show you in a moment is ways that I think it could change. But here's the point, that the old contract looked something like this. It basically said, I work to make money, to buy stuff that makes me happy. That's the great contract, isn't it, between you and your employer, that somehow the contract is negotiated by tangible assets, by money, that they are then able to spend that stuff on goods or products or services that make them happy. And what I want to suggest is that that is beginning to change. And I don't think yet that many companies, whilst you may say that sort of as a philosophy, I don't see yet many companies actually realizing how profound that change will be and how profound it's going to affect your relationship with their employees. And what I want to show later is that that relationship is going to have work at the center of it. It's going to have, I work to make me happy. Not to say that money isn't important. Of course it is. Of course it's important. But actually, fundamentally, we have to think about work as being the thing, not the money that you get from work as being the thing. And I'm going to show you a few more reasons why I think that's the case. The next thing I want to mention, though, in terms of the shifts that are changing the nature of work, is resource constraints. Now, I know right now it's not particularly fashionable to talk about climate change, but actually, historically, it's had an impact on organizational thinking, and I think it will in the future. Just to remind ourselves that this was London in the 50s. In fact, I was born in 1955, and I can remember as a child being in these sort of smogs. I can remember putting my hand out and not being able to see my own hand walking to school in the morning. I wasn't brought up in London. I was brought up in Liverpool. And here's Beijing last year. And of course, one thing to remember, and this is partly why it's so difficult to get a global consensus on climate change, is that countries are saying, you went through that without anyone telling you you had to stop, and yet you're now asking us, as we go through our industrial revolution, to do something that is going to not necessarily be in our best interest. But that's not really the point I wanted to make. The point I wanted to make is that sooner or later, people are going to begin to think again about this. And this is NASA data, and it looks at projected global temperatures. It's a scenario. I teach a class at London Business School. In fact, I'm teaching it the week after next on the future of work. It's a whole 10 lectures. And I get the head of scenario planning from Shell in to teach our students, because it's Shell is used, and I think there's some people from Shell here today, have always had amazing scenario planning. And so this is one of the things that he shows the class. And he says, look, this is where we think, we don't know where temperature change is going to go. This is our very best case scenario, and this is our sort of worst case scenario. The thing to remember is that once you hit 2%, 2 degrees of change, is when the general consensus is you begin to get significant and probably damage, which is difficult then to retrieve, irretrievable damage. Now, we're here, aren't we? We're here. Which one of those lines do you think we're currently on? The orange one or the red one? Where do you think we are? Orange or red? Yeah, we're here. So the truth is, at Davos last week, there's always people banging on about climate change. But at the moment, nobody's particularly interested in it. But my prediction is it will become interesting again. It really will become interesting again. And you've got to have, again, a point of view or a narrative about that. And the poster child for climate change, as you know, is Paul Polman from Unilever. An amazing guy, has taught at London Business School a couple of times. And what Paul has done is he's actually been very explicit about work at Unilever. And so what he said is, I want you, general managers, to reduce the carbon footprint across not just your production lines, but also your supply chains, which is a very big deal. And by the way, I'm going to pay your bonus on the basis of whether you've done that. I think Paul is very influential. I can feel the influence he's having on other CEOs. And I want to say to you that even though at the moment climate change isn't on your agenda in terms of the future of work, I think it will be. It will be within the next 5 years. And it will be because in the next 5 years, we're going to be there. We're going to hit 1 degree. And when we hit 1 degree, you'll notice that the world starts to reconsider what it's going to say about climate change. How does that affect work? Well, actually, it affects work in all sorts of interesting ways. If you take a look at Unilever's main office building as opposed to its supply chains, where do you think the major creator of CO2 is in the way it does its business in its main office? Where do you think that is? Where is that? If you were to measure all of the CO2 that Unilever creates in its headquarters, what's one of the major creators of CO2? Yeah, coming to work. Coming to work and sitting in an air-conditioned office. So if you're really serious about that, what would you say? Don't come to work. Don't get on that train. Don't sit in that air-conditioned office. And interestingly, Unilever has now got, as some of you will know, one of the most comprehensive flexible working practices. But it didn't come from anything around, wouldn't it be great for you? Although that might have been part of it. It was actually pushed forward by Polman and his team saying, you need to get your CO2 levels down. Okay. So, but of course, the challenge here, and I think it's not a challenge specifically for the future of work, but it's a challenge for the future of leadership. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of my talk today, is it does remind us that we're living in a multi-stakeholder world. And it does remind every one of us that when we teach our students, as we do, or in your case, as you help develop your leaders and managers, you've got to help them realize that they have multiple people, including societal groups, NGOs, governments, organizations, individuals, who they now have to understand. And they have to appreciate where each one of these groups are coming from. Part of it, of course, is globalization. And actually, again, if we go back, somebody asked me earlier, would I say something about Davos? Last week, because I'm a fellow of Davos and I did a lot of stuff there. Was there a theme? Well, yeah, of course there was a theme. And part of it was about the implications and backlashes of globalization. And just let's remind ourselves where we are in terms of globalization and the future of work. Immigration has been part of the story for centuries in most of our countries. It's been a huge creator of wealth and a huge creator of value right across the world. And indeed, on top of that, we're also seeing fundamental rebalancing of the world. And we've been talking about this since 2000, really. I think the year 2000 is when people started really talking about the globalization of industries. Now, you may be surprised that it hasn't happened faster than it did. I mean, actually, here's China building large companies, but maybe not as fast as you thought it might. Here's India with one of my favorite companies, Tata Consulting Services. I adore TCS. I think it's a marvelous company. Employs, by the way, now organically growing, 380,000 people, grows at 20% a year organically. That's quite a story, isn't it? So these countries are building amazing multinationals. Here's the UK, we've got fewer than we had, and France and Germany. So this is happening, but let's look at the future. And one way of predicting where the talent markets are going to be is to look at where the tertiary education is, i.e., who's been educating over the age of 16. Now, this isn't what I'm about to show you is not a perfect way of looking at talent pools, because actually in India and China, some of the educational establishments are of very poor quality. So I could have also shown you, but won't, the ranking of the world's educational institutions. And you'll know that they're mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. Very few in China, very few in India. However, let's not get complacent about this and just take a look at the figures. 2000, 2010, 2020. So that's really that's your consumer base, that's your talent base, and that's changing fundamentally. And however much people may want to push back the forces of globalization, I don't think that's going to work. I think actually that globalization will continue. And you will see countries like China and India producing enormous numbers of educated young people. And work, I think, is also shaped by social norms, by how we see ourselves, how we see our families, how we see our loved ones. Again, asking why are we working, when do we work, how do we work? And here's one of the major shapers, as I see it, and it's actually to do with family structure. This is work from Stu Friedman, who's a friend of mine who works at Wharton Business School. And for some years, he's been asking his students, and you can see we've got data here from 2012, 1992 and 2012. And this is a very simple question. Do you plan to have or to adopt children? Well, 1992, everyone pretty much said yes. And 2012, everyone pretty much says, do you know, I don't really know. And that, for me, is the point. It's not that they're going to have fewer children. They might. We don't know that. They're too young. These are MBA students. But actually, when I teach the 100-year life to my MBA students, as I do as part of my Future of Work elective, I ask them, and in fact, we've asked every single MBA student this year, because we've done a workshop for every single student. One of the questions we ask them with a little clicker is, what sort of family structure do you think you're going to have? And guess what they say? Let me ask you: how many people say that the largest number of students say we're going to have a traditional family structure where one person, i.e. the man, earns all the money? Does anyone know? How many people say it's going to be a dual career? Yeah, and it is. I mean, the vast majority of our students, and not only are they building dual careers, they're also doing what sociologists call assortative mating. They're marrying people just like them. That's happening actually in much of society. You're choosing people, you're choosing to spend time with people just like you. Of course, that's got big implications for some of the things that I spoke about earlier, because what, of course, I didn't really point out to you earlier, and maybe we should have done, I'm just remembering it, we didn't really make enough of that, did we? We didn't say enough about that. So that's, you can see assortative mating is simply going to encourage that in very, very successful family structures where each of them is the same. But interestingly, in terms of the future of work, I think that many of you in organizations are not really prepared for dual careers. You're not really prepared for the fact that actually, if you're going to live 100 years, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, to be honest, the most sensible family structure is that you balance risk between two of you. That would be absolutely the most sensible thing to do. And that means that sometimes you go off and learn or take a sabbatical or explore or do whatever, and the other person pulls in. And so this sort of what we might call a sort of seesaw option where couples somehow make it work. We think that that's, in many of the talent pools that you operate in, that's going to be what people most want to do. And that requires a level of sort of self-understanding and relationship building, which is way beyond anything that was required in a traditional marriage. And they will want you to understand that and to appreciate it. And of course, you're already seeing this, that right across the world, women are working. Women with children are working. Okay, in Korea and Italy and Japan, they're not. But actually, in many of the developed countries of the world, female participation rates are very high. And finally, of course, obviously, I'm going to talk about longevity, because you heard that Andrew and I have just finished our book. It's been out since June, about what happens when everybody lives to 100. And let me just very quickly rehearse this. And I'm going to run a workshop afterwards, so I just want to say a few things very quickly. Isn't that astounding? That's the increase in life expectancy. Where's it going to end? Actually, we had some really fancy pants doctors at Davos, and they all say 120. That's where they're sort of aiming. That's where they seem to want to live to 120. But actually, the thing that we want to suggest to you, and Andrew and I want to talk to you about in terms of long lives, in terms of a 100-year life, is it's not that you're going to be just like you are now, and then at the very end, for 20 years, you're going to be like really old, and then you're going to die. It's imagine that extra years was given to you every year. So let's say instead of having 12 months a year, you had 15. Or let's say every month, instead of having 4 weeks, you had 6 weeks. Or every week, instead of having 7 days, you had 9 days. Or every day, instead of having 24 hours, you've got 32. That's the way to think about it. That's the way to think about long lives. I think, which is why we're writing another book about it, I think it will fundamentally change. We think it will lead to a fundamental restructuring of how we think about lives, how we think about the structure of lives. And let me show you why. Andrew, the economist, worked out the finances of what you would have to do. And Jane is one of our sort of protagonists in the book. She's going to live 100 years. She was born in 1998. And if she wanted to, as many of your parents, or maybe even you thought you would, retire at 65, how much would she have to save? How many people here are saving 25% of their income? Darn it! You heard it from me. Wow. Do you know what that means? It means you're going to have to work a lot longer. What do you think is going to be the period? If you live to 100 years, and some of you will, and your kids certainly will, how long do you think you'll be working? To 100. To 100. To 80. Yeah. I mean, it's really fundamental. You know, humans, it's really fascinating to be alive now, isn't it? Because we're having to deal with unbelievable speed of technological change. And at the same time, we're going to have to work until we're 80, and it's all happening together. Wow, this is a really interesting period to be around, isn't it? We're in a transition. I've begun to realize that. We're in a major transition, just like the one that you saw after the Industrial Revolution and all the sort of misery that created before things settled down. That's where we are. So that means you're going to have to work longer. Well, that's great, because we all love work. And actually, in fact, you can see that people are already doing that. People are already working longer. Some aren't at all. Where's off? There you are. You must be the only Greek working today. You're not even 50. The two of you. What? That must be the whole Greek. And you're not even 55 yet. Okay, so where's that? What's the headlines on this? Pretty simple. You can't have a 3-stage life anymore. You've got to have a multi-stage life. You've got to do lots of different things. You've got to not just have full-time education, full-time work, and full-time retirement. Clearly, you're going to have lifelong education, aren't you? And that's your job. How exciting is that? Your job is to provide lifelong education for your employees. The government has to do the same, by the way. Your job is to help your employees lead a multi-stage life. Let them go. Why is it only academics have sabbaticals? Why can't you have a sabbatical? Why is it only our 18-year-old kids who have a gap year? Why can't you have a gap year? Why don't you become an independent producer? Why doesn't every single person in this room go out and build a company? Why aren't we doing that? Well, now I've told you that you're going to be around for another 50 years or 60 years. You've got plenty of time. Plenty of time to look after the kids, build a business, take a gap year, take a sabbatical. Wow, isn't it amazing? That's the way to think about it. And that's what you need to build as a narrative for your employees. What might you do? Look, there's lots of things you can do, but here's some things I think you could be thinking about or doing right now. Number one, prepare for diversity. I know, we've been talking about diversity forever. We all know that. But actually, I'm not just talking about gender diversity. I'm also saying that the sort of jobs that are going to be created in the future and the sort of ecosystems that are going to be supporting them will have both demographic diversity in terms of women and older workers and these couples where, one time one is working, one time the other isn't, but huge working arrangements, freelancers, joint ventures, micro enterprises. So, suddenly the idea of the man with the wife at home coming to you until the age of 65 full time, that's a minority. Please don't build your HR strategy around that person, because actually there's not many of them. They're coming in all sort of shapes of sizes. And that means, by the way, you have to redesign your HR strategy. And here's some immediate thoughts about that. Scrap graduates, internships. Forget it. Why bring everybody in when they're 21? I mean, seriously, why are you doing that? It's like, why is the government giving us all our money for education to be spent before we were 21 years old? It's mad. It's got to change. Why don't you be the company that changes it? Why aren't you bringing in 30-year-olds once they've already started their business? Why aren't you delinking pay with age? One of the reasons you don't want your over 60s to stay is because every year you pay them more. That's a mistake. It makes them very expensive. Pardon? Yeah, you need to think about whether they're productive or not. And you're only doing that because you don't have good productivity measures. If you did, you'd pay people on the basis of their performance and their productivity, not on the basis of their age. Scrap retirement. If you're in a company that says everybody should leave at 55 or 60, forget it. It was really interesting. I ran a workshop at Davos, the 100-Year Life, and one of the people that was on the panel with me, or on the workshop with me, was the woman who runs the American Association for Retired People. They don't call it that anymore. They call it AARP. It has as members, wait for this, 38 million people. It's the biggest voluntary group in the world. She said, and it really held with me, and I'm sort of mulling it over a lot. She said, because I kept saying, look at me, I'm 62, 60 is the new 40, blah, blah. She says, forget that. 60 is not the new 40. It's not the new 50. 60 is a 50-year-old with another 10 years experience. And that's the point. You need to think about your over 55s as assets, not as liabilities. And you need to think about all the wisdom and experience and, ways of thinking about the world that they've got. Okay, number 2, and you can do this right now, refocus from tangible assets, just spending all your time talking to people about money, to intangible assets. And you're very fortunate because Andrew and I have done a lot of work on intangible assets, and here they are: productivity, vitality, transformation. If you go to our website, www.100yearlife.com, you will see that you can complete a diagnostic for free, which helps you to measure whether you are depleting, maintaining, or building each one of your tangible assets. I encourage you to do it. 10,000 people have already done it. In fact, it's probably more than 10,000. Last time we looked, it was 10,000. And the results are very interesting. One thing they've shown, and we've written 2 HBR blogs about this, is guess what? The stereotyping of ages is absolute nonsense. Please do not use the word millennial, baby boomer, Gen X, Gen Y. Stop using those terms. They are stereotypical and there's no evidence for them. We found no age differences in people's interest in keeping healthy or interest in learning or interest in the way that they're using technology. We are making such terrible stereotypical comments about different age groups. Number 3, and this is my final point, this does have big implications for leadership. I'm not going to say too much about this. I wrote about this in a book called The Key, but let me just very briefly summarize what I think this means for leadership. I think basically we have to realize that leaders are operating in probably the most difficult context that we've seen them. Certainly, I've been at London Business School now for 28 years, and I can see that the context that leaders are working in is very, very complex and difficult to understand. And here's 4 reasons why that's the case. Massive short-term pressure in terms of profits. Followers who are very bold in terms of employees are very bold in terms of what they want. Citizens that are watching your tail all the time, and a great deal of transparency. So what's the way around that? I want to suggest that you might want to think, as you're thinking about building your leaders, 2 things. One is what you might call the outer journey, which is, what is it, the journey that your leaders take to understand the world that they're living in? And the other would be the inner journey. What's the journey that your leaders are taking to understand themselves? And they need to take both those, both in terms of the external journey, in terms of building alliances and understanding the world and how it might change, and in terms of authenticity, in terms of both their knowledge of themselves, but also the crucible experiences, the things that you're giving to them that help them understand themselves more deeply. And I just want to finish by saying, I'm so thrilled that everybody's here today. We are in a period of transition. I say that quite sort of loosely, but it's taken me a couple of years to realize that this is a transitional state. It has within it a great deal of anxiety. And your job as HR strategists is to help your organization and to help your employees build a narrative about the future that is honest, but at the same time positive, and then put in place what they need to make those positive changes. Thanks very much.